Hello, and thank you for choosing to listen to Lift as We Rise. My name is Roshni Gajjar. In this episode, we're going to be continuing the conversation today on just transition and green mobility. We started that in episode 23. If you missed that one, I will share the link in the description. So whether you are in the automotive or transport sector or part of the upstream value chain as a consumer, the transportation impacts our daily lives and livelihoods. The GHG, or the greenhouse gas emissions from transport in South Africa, represents about 11% of South Africa's carbon footprint. And why we're focusing on road today is because road transport accounts for about 91% of the transportation sector's total emissions. In the Nelson Mandela Bay, which I'm proud to be based in, it's the home of automotives in South Africa, which started almost 100 years ago in 1924. The other hubs in South Africa are in Gauteng and, of course, in KwaZulu-Natal. The sector moves the economy forward. About 12.5% of South Africa's exports, 4.3% of the GDP, and about 17% of our manufacturing output comes from the automotive sector, which employs about 500,000 people across its value chain. So just transition in this sector really does matter. Today, I'm speaking to Hiten Parmer, who is a game changer and a thought leader in the space of new electric vehicles ecosystem and also battery development technology in South Africa. Hiten is an executive director at Uyilo Mobility Program, and he became an early advocate for EV since 2010, and when he started Uyilo in 2013. Hello, Hiten, and thank you so much for making time to speak with me and also share your insights with us.
Greetings, Roshni. Happy to join the session and contribute to the topic. Thank you.
Hiten, thanks very much. I must share with our listeners that this is our second attempt. The last weekend was kind of derailed because of not only load shedding, we must admit, it was also the Microsoft issue. So these things do happen and perhaps a little bit relevant to the subject that we're speaking about today. So the automotive value chain is one of four that has been identified in South Africa's Just Transition Framework as a sector at risk alongside coal, agriculture, and tourism. So, Hiten, you are working at a very interesting and I guess complex intersection of academic research, industry, and government to progress this green transport strategy. Take us through the last decade. What has been happening in the EV space from the space you sit in?
Yeah, so certainly I think South Africa has had some activities on the electric vehicle side, early pilots and initiatives on that. But we saw the first introductions of hybrid electric vehicles in 2005, fully electric battery electric vehicles in 2013, and then the plug-in hybrid electric vehicles in 2015. And that's been the developments on that space. We now have slowly development of local assembly in the manufacturing sector of hybrid vehicles, and with some announcements being made within the media space on anticipated battery electric production. So, as you highlighted within your introductions, that's going to be a key focal area for South Africa to transition from the manufacturing sector, because the auto industry is a flagship entity for manufacturing and key contributor both economic development and job creation. So that's what is key required in terms of that. But also on that front, outside of passenger vehicles, we have activities in South Africa on electric bus pilots, electric trucks, last mile logistics services, which is actually proudly South African, fully commercialized, designed and manufactured electric vehicle that's currently being deployed in South Africa, and export opportunities for that and activities on that front as well. Over the last decade as well, we've seen charging infrastructure being established across the country. We are currently ranked within the top 5 globally for EV charging infrastructure ratio to available electric vehicles. I know that might be comprehended against, but we don't have many electric vehicles. But we are in a very good position at the moment across the multiple role players that have deployed infrastructure on the ground to readiness South Africa from that perspective. So we're in a good foot on that position, because as and where we see new products being introduced into the market, that curve will try and match that and grow that with that. So other regions are trying to play catch up in terms of they got the vehicles, and they're trying to support the infrastructure development. So, there has been progressions over the years in terms of that. We have supporting policy frameworks, we're having supporting standards, and other developments in the country from that perspective. So it is in development, but progressing in terms of that.
Hiten, so this afternoon we'll hear the State of the Nation addressed by our President. We're recording this on the 9th of February. Now, South Africa has, as we all know, serious systemic challenges which are at the basic level of needs: jobs, food, security, healthcare, education. Of course, this energy crisis. So that means that private and public sector leaders are going to have to really be smart and be fully aligned to a single vision that has a high chance of effective execution. Tell us about the green transport strategy, and how does that align with the 2035 SA Automotive Master Plan?
Yeah, certainly. So I think, in the previous comments, I mentioned about some of the developments in South Africa. So if we look, just ahead of the green transport strategy, we've got our National Development Plan of 2030, and that certainly speaks to the promotion of sustainable transport and a sustainable society. So we acknowledge that vision in South Africa from that first point of view. The other aspect, specifically against transport, is the National Green Transport Strategy, as you highlighted, introduced in 2018, and Strategic Pillar 8 speaks to the promotion of hybrid electric vehicles. So again, with that, we acknowledge that pillar within that framework. We understand government's position on that paper. As advocates, we would promote and lobby for stronger commitments on that framework, but we acknowledge the Strategic Pillar 8 composition of that within the Green Transport Strategy. Now, if we look at the Automotive Master Plan of 2035, the target there is to South Africa to move to up to 1% of global production. That's a tall order and ambitious. And currently, our whole value chain is dominated across the internal combustion engine technology. So with that, we're seeing, the challenge in South Africa from that. And it is one of the conundrums that South Africa faces in how do we transition. Because 60% of the vehicles we manufacture in South Africa are exported to the EU. And EU countries are banning internal combustion engines from as close as 2025. And major announcements from 2030 onwards. So South Africa is going to lose its principal markets of exports. And what is required is a transition of South Africa's automotive manufacturing industry to be able to be globally competitive. So it's important that, one, we achieve global competitiveness. We drive transformation from a technology perspective in terms of that, not only to secure current markets, but also grow to achieve the vision of the Automotive Master Plan by 2035. So if we don't transition right now, we're going to not achieve those specific targets, and then be subject to that in terms of not moving fast enough in terms of that.
Hiten, thanks. And the opportunity certainly is a massive one, and I think a positive one for South Africa. In the UK, they reported that the 2022 numbers, NEVs sailed up from 5% to 16%, and that's quite a big jump. As you mentioned, in South Africa, the uptake currently has been low, and also there's the cost factor from an import duties perspective. I heard on CNBC that about 69% of Africa is without electricity, and that's something important to this project we're talking about. But from a business perspective, unless we have economies of scale and we reach that at speed, the commercial viability becomes unsustainable. So in order for us to get there, yes, it's an aspirational requirement, but what are the critical success factors from your point of view for us to execute this plan effectively?
There's a few pillars that we bank on, in South Africa from that perspective. Obviously, we've got a unique situation in South Africa, unlike other African countries where we have a legacy automotive industry. both of economic contribution and job creation. And we need to, make sure that transition is just as the major term is from that perspective. So through that, so if we look at it, what is the barriers of uptake of electric vehicles? I think in all regions it's acknowledged on consumer awareness. We need to drive bigger consumer awareness in terms of that, and platforms like this that we are recording with yourselves is just one of these in demystifying, some of the perceptions of electric vehicles, but also creating a platform for education and awareness of what is the market in terms of that. So that's fully acknowledged. On the second front, the demand, there's been multiple surveys done in South Africa that there is enormous demand and appetite for EVs in the country. The major challenge is affordability. And obviously, once you explain the concept of range anxiety, that we do have charging infrastructure across the country, as referenced earlier, you then look at, this is great. It's also a benefit on maintenance costs and operational costs for running an EV. The upfront cost is slightly higher, but you see the total benefit once you look at the full total cost of ownership, where you have better return on investment from that perspective. So the challenge, again, with the upfront cost contributing factor on that is the current customs and excise duty and ad valorem duty that's imposed on electric vehicles that are higher, and that's a inhibitant to the market at the moment. But so what in order to transform South Africa, we need to have a revision in the customs and excise duties and ad valorem duties to make sure that EVs are not disadvantaged from that perspective. We try and create a leveling playing field. Ideally, we want to create an incentive to drive local demand from that perspective. Ideally, we would like to see a reduction of that from a taxation point of view. And this is important because this will be a forego of revenue for the fiscus, not necessarily new funding that's required. So this is what we need to change the mindsets on that, because as we look at many countries, they are creating subsidies and incentives. However, in this case, we don't need to create an incentive, financial incentive. This can be just some forego from the fiscus to support development of this market, and it can be also limited to a specific time frame in terms of that. But more importantly, so that first point speaks to developing the growth of local demand and matching that. But more importantly, we need to drive the manufacturing of components for electric vehicles. And that is all across the board in terms of that. And through that, if you look at the statistics from a job creation point of view, for every person that's employed within the assembly economy, there's 4 jobs created in the component industry. So we look at that. So that's going to be a compounding aspect to support that on that front. So it's important that we drive that development of new energy vehicle components in South Africa, and that's what will certainly change that. Because we have the standards, some policy frameworks and some building blocks to supporting that, but that's going to be the biggest change in South Africa that we need to see. And we expect that. There's been a lot of lobbying work of the last 18 months, and we expect the next few months to present, including tonight's State of the Nation address, on some context on how we're going to transition. We also have the Just Energy Transition Partnership supported by $8.5 billion in that transition, of which electric vehicles are included on that. So we see a number of frameworks starting to shape up in South Africa for at least a better horizon for 2023 and 2024.
Hiten, you shared with me before we started recording that you were recently on a trip to India. Just out of interest from an incentivization point of view, from supporting the market economically, what types of strategies are other countries implementing, particularly the emerging markets?
Yeah, so I think, from the international scene, there's a number of key references, and I think that's with, developed countries that have the revenue streams and supporting mechanisms to support financial incentives. But the key conundrum is the emerging economies and developing economies and countries on how are they going to sustainably transition with that. We fully acknowledge certain developing countries, India such as one, that have given strong commitments, including the phase out of internal combustion engines by a specific date. As much as it's ambitious, it's a bold commitment to developing that. And you can actually see that, because out of that, and just last week, being invited to the International Transport Forum on emerging economies, contributing to that from South Africa and Africa's perspective, you get to see that framework in India from execution of that bold commitment of phase out of internal combustion engines. You're seeing almost 98% of all states in India have declared EV policy frameworks already approved, where the balance of that minor percentage is in draft format. So that is expected within the next few months to be finalized. Then you look at the whole country, not only from a national perspective, but also at state level, that's fully committed into transitioning in that. So we fully acknowledge that. The other aspect is we spoke about the local manufacturing perspective. So India also has that framework, and the Made in India perspective is actually a reality on the ground. You get to see the buses, manufactured in India on the roads. You're looking at the micro-mobility solutions, the two-wheelers, three-wheelers as well, already on the roads in terms of that. And even vehicles manufactured, passenger vehicles manufactured in India are on the road as well. So, this is what is a key reference example for emerging economies and emerging countries to say this is what is achievable. Yes, every country has its challenges, but this actually shows what is being achieved. We all reference Norway, close to 80% as 80% of new car sales is electric, but obviously they don't have a legacy automotive industry. They've got reserves to support the incentives, but that actually shows what is achievable, in that space. But India is a good reference example in emerging economies to say what can be done. So I think there's a lot of attention now within recent months, and it's also coming out of COP to say how are we going to support the emerging economies in their sustainable transition towards that. So again, over the next few years, at least the next 5 years, we're going to see a lot of supporting mechanisms coming into the emerging economies for transition to zero-emission vehicles.
That's really interesting and important to keep a watch on these things, whether you're in the industry or not, because the threat of those countries taking away production from South Africa is a real one. And even if we have the best intent to implement this operationally, if it's not economically viable, then unfortunately you've got to forfeit those opportunities. Hiten, Hildegard Wortmann, who's the Audi AG Sales and Marketing Management Board member, was in South Africa recently, very excited about new charging stations in the country. In fact, the first 200 kilowatt DC charger. But she acknowledged that it's going to take time for this market, she says, to transform, and that the transformation doesn't stop only at the vehicle production and the battery conversation, but it spills over to the sales side, the service side, and of course the entire value chain. You've been in this game for quite a while. You've seen and heard firsthand what's happening in South Africa, on the African continent, internationally. If you had to share with us your vision about what a reimagined SA automotive industry looks like, say by 2035, what would you say are the realistic scenarios for carbon neutral versus zero carbon for South Africa?
Yeah, so that's speaking of the automotive master plan. It also ties into that, to where we really need to go. I think the important aspect is that South Africa needs to transition. That's important. Now, if we look at the manufacturing opportunities, globally there is demand for electric vehicles. The OEMs are gearing up. They have the supporting technologies to support the transition. The major bottleneck that's being identified is on battery production. When you step back further, you look at supply of materials to support battery production. Some of the new establishments of mines to support supply, from exploration to driving supply of the minerals, and development of that is a 10-year cycle. So this is where a lot of the investment and activities are now in securing supply chains with that. The important aspect, not only looking with the South African lens, is the African lens, is that Africa, and specifically sub-Saharan Africa, is endowed with the minerals to support new energy vehicle component production. I'm speaking of battery-grade minerals and also all other components that support the mineral supply. So electric vehicles, and specifically battery electric vehicles, provide a significant opportunity for Africa to leapfrog, not only for the mobility transition, but also energy transition with that. Because when we look at battery technologies and the sustainable materials required in that, Africa can supply its resources to beneficiate and drive this development. So that's what's key. So the key thing is in Africa and South Africa to transition is to drive that development of that ecosystem to support manufacturing in Africa and in South Africa, because that's what's going to be key in terms of that. It's imperative that we establish battery cell manufacturing in the country to support this. And it's important to note that this battery production will not only be for the automotive industry. Yes, automotive is a significant catalyzer to that, but it will also complement the energy storage sector, supporting the electricity sector on that transition. So it's an important prerogative on that. And then, when we look at it from the component sector as well, we have a very strong component supply chain in South Africa, Tier 1, Tier 2, Tier 3, and Tier 4, that's active. And within that are multinationals that have access to the global leading technologies. So once we have the right signals in South Africa, these global component role players can access those technologies and manufacture. So I think this is what is required from that perspective. From an infrastructure perspective, I touched on that. So I personally, I don't see that as a challenge. On the energy crisis, yes, it is a related reality, but perceived reality, because when you look at it, load shedding has actually created a very interesting scenario for EVs in South Africa. Out of this conundrum that it's created, a chaos both in private and business, it's actually deployed a lot of renewables onto the grid. And if you look at India, for example, they have a fairly steady grid, but now they're trying to deploy renewables onto that. Now, how do you try and drive investment and deployment on renewables when you've got a reliable grid? It's slightly challenging. But in South Africa's case, because of the energy crisis, it's what's driven deployment on renewables, both at commercial scale and private scale. So that is very enabling to EVs, because private homeowners and also businesses already have backup power systems, solar systems, shopping malls. You mentioned about that as well for the 200 kilowatt charger that's backed up by solar. So it's a very interesting flip side to look at it from that perspective. So yes, I think those are the key areas that we look at it from that perspective. There are a lot of areas to resolve in terms of the manufacturing capacity and getting that transition, but we are currently well positioned and certainly need to get faster traction in transitioning now, so that we can secure manufacturing because the interest is there, the commitments and targets for the OEMs are there. We just need to create a stronger market environment for South Africa in supporting this transition, both the OEMs and the component sector as well.
Hiten, I could see that you seemed quite excited when you mentioned the Norway example, and they're prohibiting ICE engines by 2025 and most of the rest of the world 2035. It's interesting to see how the various OEMs are responding to it through their own strategies. For example, Toyota's taking a more kind of diversified approach. What is your view? Is it a case of, by 2035, it's going to be zero carbon, or is there going to be a hybrid model for South Africa? How should we start thinking about these things? Is it going to be an overnight switch that by a certain date we're going to be moving over? And if so, how realistic is that? Or is there a more pragmatic way that this can be approached?
So certainly I think there will be a natural progression in terms of we see the market development and each growth on the curve in terms of the market growth is determined on a number of factors, policy frameworks, incentives, and other mechanisms in terms of that. So with that, we see a gradual transition happening. What's important and what's really great to see is that we fully acknowledge the regions that have given bold commitments to phase out ICE. technologies. And through that, it's what has developed the market itself in terms of that. When it's stronger regulations enforced at national level from a country perspective, but also from a city perspective, the OEMs are now faced with the situation where they cannot supply their legacy products into the market, and they have to radically shift to new energy vehicle products. So that's what's driving the growth of this technology and products being made available, because the legacy OEMs don't have a market anymore to supply their product, and that's what's driving development, investment, and this whole supply of electric vehicles. The other aspect on that is that technology, because of this, technology is radically improved in terms of battery technology and charging technology, and also from a cost perspective from solar and battery in supporting that. So this is the important aspect coming into play. So it's a natural evolution that will flow. We're already seeing, as much as it was perceived that battery electric vehicles will be challenged in certain areas from their range ability and charging ability. The growth of innovation and deployment in this space has really changed that. You've got vehicles, some of the range tests on some of the models have achieved over 1,000 kilometers, driving on a full battery electric vehicle. We've got high power charging infrastructure that's capable now with, charging within a few minutes in terms of that. So it's radically evolving. So South Africa will see that progression. It's all purely determined on what products come into the market. And once we create a better enabling environment and supporting environment for new product introductions, that will really determine the growth curve in South Africa from that perspective as well. Technology is radically evolving, and I think hybrids will just be an interim measure from the technology. But certainly, when you look at the full turnkey solution, especially supporting energy infrastructure, so what I mean by that is solar infrastructure supported by battery technology, charging infrastructure, and fleets of EVs. That is what drives the full business case and investments into this specific framework. And if you're looking at South Africa, that's ideal candidate because you have a crippled energy sector, and from a market perspective and development and investment perspective, it starts to shape up to say, let's do these investments on renewables, supported by storage, charging infrastructure, and supporting fleets of EVs, because that's what drives that. So, as we see South Africa's market environment change to create more supporting mechanisms for EVs, we'll radically see that shift grow up in terms of the growth curve in terms of that. We also acknowledge that there are some signals from the hydrogen economy, although battery electric vehicle technologies have radically advanced in that space. So at this stage, we'll watch how the markets develop and what products come into the market. There are challenges with other types of technologies in terms of the supporting infrastructure that's required, where electricity from that perspective is already a strong network established in South Africa and other regions as well. And that's what creates an interesting opportunity for battery electric vehicles, in that there is an existing infrastructure. It can be supported with renewables and storage, and that's what is a win-win case from that perspective. Until such time there are new energy carriers and energy services available from that to support new modes of mobility and new technologies, then we will see greater uptake in terms of that. But certainly in other regions, we're acknowledging that battery electric vehicles certainly have a significant opportunity on that perspective.
Hiten, thank you very much. My mind's going through to the factory floor now for the OEM side. If we are moving from production of ICE vehicles to EVs, how will the factory floor configuration or the production flow change? Can you give us a quick overview?
Fortunately, in my career, I had some experiences through my career in automation and robotics in building a lot of the assembly lines for the plants in South Africa. Now, if you look at that from that perspective, and having visited some of the plants internationally, locally as well, doing some of the hybrid and also full EV production internationally, that supply chain is a full process that flows from that. So when you're looking at the specific technology on battery electric vehicles, the rest of the car is all basically the same. So there's no fundamental shift in that. Only at the time where they put the electric powertrain will you have a new line system being developed and building of that specific technology. So from a vehicle manufacturing perspective, there is no major significant change from that perspective. The lower supply chain, yes, that's where the shift starts happening. So we need to, there is new skills required, there's new technology required for the component production, especially from the design. Although South Africa doesn't have a strong or existing strong design and manufacturing perspective from components. A lot of that is manufactured internationally. I'm talking powertrain technology on new energy vehicles, and that's where the shift is required from that perspective in changing that. So from a vehicle assembly point of view, there's no major disruption in terms of that expected. Even from a skill level in terms of assembly, there's no major skill sets required from that. That's important to note, because the production process is a standard process that follows, and the electrified components get assembled and integrated in that. The value chain lower down from a manufacturing perspective and supplies perspective is where the shift is required, and specific skill sets required for new energy vehicle technology on that perspective.
So Hiten, if I as a vehicle owner or as a fleet owner can't afford the upfront investment, which is a bit more expensive, is there any way to kind of adapt existing vehicles with the newer technology? So that, is there any way that type of transition can be supported?
I think just on the affordability side, we fully acknowledge some of the banks and other financiers that are starting to look at creating finance mechanisms and already have finance mechanisms to support purchasing of EVs and with preferred rates for a green choice. So most of our banks already support that currently in South Africa. Now, when you're looking at the framework that you mentioned, which is more on the conversion side, we have to acknowledge the regulations from what's called homologation of the vehicle, and I'll caution against that to make sure that anybody that is venturing down that road does align to the national requirements of that, and making sure that any change on technologies is certified and tested and aligned with the Compulsory Specification Authority, which is the NRCS, in making sure that any vehicle that's changed from its original form is safe to do so on the road. Because the challenge with this is, if it is done in a private capacity, that liability holds with the owner. However, it's on a commercial scale, that entity that is doing the conversions takes full liability against changing the vehicle which it was originally homologated to a new type of technology. So that's just the caution from that perspective. In certain regions, we fully acknowledge that there is a strong conversions market taking place on that. But yes, that is one of the frameworks that are existence in terms of conversions on that front. But there are some areas to be fair with when venturing down that journey.
Well, that's perhaps another opportunity within the value chain for those business models that need to adapt to this to avoid becoming irrelevant. Hiten, you mentioned the security around battery supply, component supply, and all this requires money. Germany's just committed another $1.1 billion in addition to the existing European package. Bloomberg reports that in the US, an extra $28 billion has been directed towards electric mobility investments following the Inflation Reduction Act. And that act has unlocked $370 billion to stimulate EV production. In the UK, in January, we heard the collapse of Britvolt, and the UK banked on this project. $5 billion was invested in a gigafactory to produce about 30,000 battery packs a year, creating 3,000 jobs targeted, and that hasn't gone well. They're looking for new forms of funding. And Andy Parmer, who's the former Aston Martin CEO, made an interesting observation. He said, ultimately for Britain, the car manufacturing will eventually migrate to where the battery factories are. And that also affects, of course, the skills gap. We already have a brain drain in South Africa, and we can see the consequences of what political interference does, for example, in the Eskom crisis. What should South Africa be thinking about, and prioritizing to secure the battery supply, secure the component supply, to make sure that if another kind of COVID-19 happens and we have issues in the supply chain, that we're not waiting for parts and materials to come from other countries.
Yeah, so I think the impact of the pandemic also was a realization for not only South African companies, but many companies on trying to insource supply chain wherever possible. And through that, there's been also a refocus on that. And, out of that frustration of that, it's actually what drove development. From a crisis of that, it's driving development on supply chain. So there's a positive impact in terms of that for even pushing stronger localization and regional supply chains from that perspective. So I think, referencing the earlier reference on, the mineral supply chains, I think that's what is now important to start shifting this from a SADC region. And we also acknowledge the AFCTA, the Free Trade Agreement for Africa, that this is a strong, opportunity for that. And the Secretary General as well earlier acknowledged that, electric vehicles certainly provide the opportunity for South Africa to leverage and Africa to leverage that under the AFCTA. And that's what's going to be important. We need to use that mechanism and that agreement that is in place to support this transition, and then also drive development in Africa for Africa in this transition that's required. We require a lot of regional cooperation from that perspective. We acknowledge that certain developments are already in place in terms of that. Some to reference in that the president of Congo and Zambia have signed a joint declaration to support battery production because of the wealth of cobalt in Congo as well as copper in Zambia. And then additionally, Zimbabwe, as the fifth largest reserves of lithium, also provided an updated framework to manage the exportation of raw lithium ore to process refinery locally in the country. And those are some of the developments in terms of that. So this is what is going to be key in driving that development in these regions in Africa from that perspective.
Hiten, I know you're not a mining specialist. That's always been one of South Africa's key export drivers to attract foreign direct investment. But we've always stopped at the primary level and lost the opportunity around the secondary and tertiary sectors there. So this time around, your work at Uyila around battery development, etc., realizes the importance of these minerals and PGMs. Are conversations happening between the auto sector, the mining sector, around how that ecosystem can be, let's call it, better developed or matured for another source of export revenue?
Uylo's perspective, under our enterprise development initiatives, we have the Kickstart Fund, which is currently open for 2023, where we support up to 1 million rand grant on supporting development and industrialization of products, services, and technologies. And through that, over the last 9 years, since 2014, we've developed and funded some of the projects that have been supporting the supply chain of that perspective. So that's what's important in terms of that. From a facilities point of view, we have accredited battery testing that certifies and provides fit-for-purpose products aligned to international standards and OEM standards for the product, and that's what is being supported in terms of that. So I think what we also acknowledge in the battery space is that the battery assembly market is very active in South Africa based on the energy crisis. So we have an active battery assembly. What we need to drive in South Africa is cell manufacturing. And that's what's going to be the key thing to support the auto sector as well as the energy sector as well. While there are challenges with that, there are significantly opportunities on that. The mining indaba is currently taking place in Cape Town, and that is certainly one of the relative topics in terms of that. But we should also not forget the opportunities in beneficiating minerals from waste, and I think that's also one of the frameworks coming in. The technology is mature on that, and also promotion of the circular economy, We have a regulation in South Africa that's driving that under the EPR. So it's also something to be worthy of. But yeah, as I mentioned earlier, it's really relying on capitalizing the mineral resources in Africa, in strengthening that, driving and managing import and export control of these minerals, and driving the regional development for that.
Hiten, you mentioned the Kickstart Fund, and I know funding is always hard to come by. So for those who are listening in and are in this space, do you want to maybe unpack that for us a little bit? Give us some information on that fund and how it can be accessed.
Indeed, it's been an annual open call that we run for 30 days, typically a month. It's been the beginning of the year, which is currently open now for 2023. It's a two-tier grant funding that's made available. Individual projects are funded up to R500,000, and collaborative partnership projects are co-financed up to R2 million, with R1 million grant from the Kickstart Fund. And that's really supporting development of technologies, products, and services in South Africa for the local and global market. It's focused across the value chain, from battery technology, vehicles, vehicle components, charging infrastructure, and connected services, where we support startups and SMEs and businesses to develop those supporting products and services in South Africa to catalyze that. We've got a number of success stories of the past projects funded that have developed over time, and also participating in the local market and global market. So certainly that is one of the support mechanisms, because we acknowledge, as you mentioned, funding is a challenge, and that's been one of the key contributors and success stories of the Uyilo Kickstart Fund in its contribution to localization and development of the sector locally.
Hiten, where can people find information?
That is available on our website on the Kickstart Fund page. So that's www.uyilo.org.za.
So Hiten, it would be remiss of us to not address the issue of skills and the importance of skills to the sustainability of this industry in South Africa. And we've had the privilege of both of us working at the Nelson Mandela University. And Mandela said education has the power to change the world. Now, in South Africa, we have a fragmented education system. Basic education, higher education sit under different departments. And the situation at basic education is particularly dire. Our maths and science rates are quite poor. And from an employment perspective, about 2/3 of South Africa's youth are unemployed. So for this green transportation strategy to succeed, Hiten, we're going to need a continuous pipeline of quality STEM talent. In your opinion, what needs to be done to navigate this challenge? And what can business, academia, and government do together to reach the goal?
Yeah, certainly. So I think skills is acknowledged in that front as well. From the recent trip to India as well, they are having that challenge in developing the skill sets for that. And South Africa also faces its broader brain drain across that. What's important is that we start developing the value chain on skills development in South Africa. There are some initiatives underway, and it's also within the JETP framework that we support skills development on that front as well. We do acknowledge the developments on the national qualifications framework in South Africa, that we do have a qualification supporting knowledge development for hybrid and electric vehicles, and that will naturally evolve in terms of growing that specific qualification in terms of that. A lot of the skills development is being done at the OEM level within the dealerships. However, there is wider auto sector development required for the skills for electric vehicles. When we look at the tertiary education and primary education, that is certainly a lot of development required from there. Unfortunately, a lot of the curriculum is still legacy from a technology point of view, and we need to start having that transformation on that so that the youth of today, which are the leaders of tomorrow, are going to be trained and have the necessary skill set for their supporting technologies in their career paths on that point. So it's a very important transition that's required in South Africa that this needs to happen. It needs infrastructure development. It needs trainers and educators to be equipped and understanding the knowledge development. we need the course material to develop from that, and then delivery of those the supporting training on that.
Yeah, and Hiten, it's really interesting that you started your professional career based at university shortly after your studies. So you fully understand and you fully vested in seeing this materialize, and possibly it adds a extra depth to what you bring to the table on these supercritical discussions.
Yeah, indeed. From that perspective, certainly on that contribution. But the broader impact of the WELO program is, as a national program, is taking that, achieving that development and sector development from a national perspective, and what the program has been delivering, across the ecosystem. Skills is just one, but the program continues to deliver on supporting the energy landscape, renewable energy landscape from that perspective, infrastructure, the standards, policies, regulations, supporting the mobility options, looking at connectivity, skills development, and also recycling. So it's this transition into electric mobility requires the ecosystem approach, and certainly skills is one of the frameworks to do that. But we acknowledge some of the initiatives already underway in supporting the skills framework, and it's an imperative that South Africa does deliver to this.
Hiten, huge admiration on your vision very early on, when in 2010 the rest of us were focusing on post-2008 crisis in business, and I guess the joy of the World Cup, and you saw this EV thing and said, you know what, there's a different direction that the world's going into, and here we are about a decade later. Hiten, we are running out of time. So my last question to you is taking us away from the kind of hard talks and just looking at what brought you here. So we're both passionate about motorsport. It certainly for me represents, inspiration and aspiration, and how that drives high performance at a very different level. You are aware of the Future Ones not-for-profit that we've set up to run the Formula One in Schools program. And the aim there is to really try and supplement maths and science with something that's practical but also fun and exciting. You yourself, when I was at the varsity, were part of the Formula Student program with the NMU racing team. So you probably understand what this is all about and how it shapes you as a person. And then, a really exciting month in South Africa, Formula E in Cape Town at the end of this month. And you mentioned that you're going to be at the E-Fest also in Cape Town. And I think it's a fantastic opportunity for our kids to witness this level of motorsport. So, Hiten, my question to you is this. For young people out there who are high performers, high achievers, and giving it 100% despite the odds, what does it take for someone to reach and sustain success as a high performer as you have in the automotive sector in South Africa?
Thanks, Roshni. I think the key thing is finding the passion, in what you want to be and what you enjoy. There's been a number of references that if you're not enjoying what you do on a daily basis, that will not bring the longevity and happiness in what you do. So for me, automotive industry was my passion. It's been my full career path in various segments of the sector, and currently delivering now to the current and future technology of electric mobility. My recommendation is find the passion to the youth on what you do, and chase that and support that. The automotive industry is certainly in a transitional phase. But just so is the all other areas. You're looking at energy sector, ICT. So certainly, computer science technology is going to be one of the leading career paths for that. And whatever exposure from a financial, whether it's financial or non-financial experience across your career path is key to doing that. And Formula Student is just one of those in supporting that. Other universities also have other frameworks in terms of that, but for the automotive industry, certainly that's a key development. We hope to see further development and support from the national associations to start supporting these sort of initiatives so that we can take the practical aspects out of the classroom and start developing those skills, in terms of that. And that's what's important from that perspective. Motorsport certainly has been driving a lot of investment and development of the technologies, which then filter down to the road cars. And that's really what was the vision of Formula E, which is now moved into other categories all across electric motorsport, Extreme E, Rallycross, and others. Certainly we acknowledge that development in the global automotive landscape. And what is key is starting to develop that from the youth and exposure of youth into that. So it's a key requirement to get done. But certainly, in closing, it's about passion, finding that vision, and then moving towards that, and build on that personal development, and then also technical skills to back that up.
Well, Hiten, thank you. You've certainly shared your passion and insights with us in a very easy to understand way, and your dedication to the work you're doing. I can absolutely appreciate that 10 years is a long journey, and we've just started now with the implementation phase. So wishing you and Uyilo well in all the work that you guys are doing.
Great. Thanks so much, Roshni.
I trust that you listeners enjoyed listening to Hiten share his insights and expert perspectives. If you did, be sure to share this episode, subscribe, and if something struck you, feel free to comment. You can, of course, also go on the Uyilo Mobility website to check out what work they're doing. And now you can follow the developments in the industry, perhaps with a little more insight. And from a business perspective, the transition, maybe factor that into your strategies to see from your asset base of fleet vehicles, etc., how are you going to adapt your strategy to become part of this EV evolution in South Africa? So in the process, while you're doing that, be sure to lift as you rise so that with purpose we can thrive. Thank you, and we'll see you again next time. Bye-bye.